Good afternoon, everyone. iTech India welcomes all the participants for today's National Distance Learning Seminar Series. Today's topic is mental health issues and challenges among key population, and the speaker is Dr. Preeti Prabhukhate. Dr. Preeti Prabhukhate is a social development professional with 15 years of rich expertise in mental health counseling, training, and research. She is a graduate from the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, has a degree in psychiatric social work from NIMHANS, and a PhD in social work from University of Illinois, Chicago. She was actively involved in providing training to the healthcare professionals in counseling and mental health issues of MSM and other vulnerable populations. Dr. Preeti also specializes in providing affirmative counseling services for LGBTQI and their families. Dr. Preeti is also currently working as the Global Lead Impact and Evidence at the International Planned Parenthood Federation. We welcome you, ma'am, for today's session and request you to start the session.
Thank you very much, Shweta, for welcoming me, and good afternoon, everybody, for joining the session today. It's my pleasure and my privilege to have been invited to talk to everybody today. I see that the participants are people with from all across the country and working in various capacities in HIV care delivery. So I'm not sure whether I'll answer all your questions, but I will try my best to cover as many areas as I can in this 1 hour that we have with each other. So as Shweta ma'am has mentioned, I'll be today talking about mental health issues and challenges among key population. So I think we need to understand that we are trying to talk about many groups over here that are, in my opinion, very special and challenging to work with. And it's kind of not fair to put all of them under the same umbrella. But for the lack of time and resources, what I've tried to do in this presentation is I've tried to make my presentation around what I feel are the common threads with regards to mental health issues and challenges that people like us who work with key populations face when we're doing our work in our ART centers, in our facilities, in our TIs. So with this small disclaimer, I'll begin my session. Okay, so by and large, I have divided my session today in 3 sections. First, we'll try to understand what are the sources of mental health problems among key populations. Why do they face so much of stress? Where does it come from? What is the origin? What happens to them, to this particular set of people, communities that make them more vulnerable? Then we'll talk about how do you understand what are mental health problems, what you see in front of your eyes, what are the things that you need to be concerned about, what can you do about it? When do you refer, and what things can you manage at your own level and within your own constraints? Section 3 is, I feel, a very important session which often doesn't get spoken about, is how do us as service providers, I'm assuming here as counselors, but anybody I would say who works closely with key populations and is trying to help them, how do we take care of our own self, our own mental health, right? Because sometimes empathy can come with a cost. And we have to learn to maintain our own mental health, at the same time being ethical and being just and being non-judgmental with our clients. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So we'll begin the presentation today. So what you see here is an iceberg. If you've watched Titanic, you'll realize that an iceberg basically like this. It's only 1/3 that's visible above water, 2/3 is underwater. And that is not Titanic, but I just thought it's a nice visual. So what you see is just what's on the top. What you do not see is the portion below. Now, why am I presenting this iceberg model over here? Is because I think this kind of visual gives us a good understanding about the lives of key populations, right? Because what we see is the visible, right? What do I mean by visible? By visible, I mean that we see behaviors, right, of people. We see people's drug use, we see poor treatment compliance, we see that our clients who are coming into our centers, talking to us, are begging on trains, on buses, are clapping, are engaging in a lot of risky behavior, despite your counseling, and have multiple sexual partners, right? Some of them are unkempt and some of them just don't care and they keep relapsing. So this is the visible that you see among your clients when you meet them, right, in your individual sessions or in your center. What we do not see is the invisible. And what is the invisible? Invisible are the multiple pressures that our vulnerable populations, our key populations, have to live with. Where we see them now in the visible, there have been many invisible factors that have driven them to where they are today and continue to still enact upon them. So for example, if you talk to a person, you'll realize that right from childhood, many people who have LGBTQ sexual orientation, transgender people, right? Even women who eventually land up in sex work will tell you that they are facing a lot of ridicule and rejection from people who are not from their community, right? So if you talk to a trans person, they will tell you that how since childhood, they've faced a lot of name calling in their schools, in their communities, within their families itself. There is a lot of pressure that young children are forced to wear clothes in a particular way, dress up in a particular way, don't move your hands, don't move your hips when you walk, be like a boy or be like a girl, don't play outside too much. Why are you wearing shirt pant? You should be wearing a frock or a dress or a salwar suit. Also in extreme cases, people are often forced to leave home. And when I say forced to leave home, it's just not physically forced to leave home, but with no point of them returning back because there is no support for them back in their family, to the extent that they lose out on their inheritance rights too. So you're left without a family, without any social and emotional support, and without any asset which was going to be rightfully yours, at least a part of it. So a lot of key populations that you interact with have been facing rejection, ridicule, pressure, right, to fall into what is socially acceptable behavior right since their early age. So by early age, not necessarily childhood for everybody, but people who have been facing gender identity issues, for them particular people who understand that their sexual orientation is not heterosexual, might start facing this much earlier in life. But people who eventually fall into company that leads to drug use also may face these problems. So as I said in the beginning, you cannot draw a line where the pressure to comply with rigid gender roles is only for one key population, but these are some common strands that may apply to one or more than one key population. What happens eventually when the person grows up even more is that they face abuse at home and school. Many people you will meet in your centers have not been able to complete their education or are not able to hold on to a formal job, right? And that's because they face a lot of harassment, ridicule, abuse in their schools, in their colleges, which makes it difficult for them to want to go back to schools or colleges, right? So imagine a scenario where you keep getting bullied every day in your college where you go. People hit on you sexually, people try to make inappropriate overtures, you have no friends because you are different. Very low chances that you too might continue in the same educational institute. And that's why you see many people who are in addiction, or many people who have trans identity or LGBTQ have struggled really to complete their degrees and have also struggled to find jobs that they can keep. And therefore many people are actually pushed into sex work, are pushed into begging, are pushed into asking for alms on the trains, or even dancing on birthdays and all. There is a element of our customs to it, but they also would like a proper white collar job if given a choice, and if given the protection needed against that. So these are some of the problems that we do not see, yet we only see the behavior, we see the end result, but we do not see what has brought them to this point of time in their life when we meet them. So I just wanted to give a bit of a perspective on that. Moving on, we'll go a little deeper into that. So the same iceberg diagram, but I just tried to explain these factors a little differently. As I said, there are family expectations, like a boy should be like a boy who should be earning, breadwinner, should marry at a right point of time, should have children, and preferably male child, right? Gender roles, a girl should be like a girl. Financial pressures, you can all, I think, relate with that. We all have financial pressures, but key populations in particular find it difficult to find a job, to keep a job, are very often discriminated, paid less at work as compared to others, and therefore are forced into selling sex, for example. They do not have financial security themselves. There are societal norms which obviously play against them. The legal environment, say up until now in our country, the legal environment was not favorable for LGBTQI. Now it has changed, but that necessarily doesn't mean that the change in the word of law has improved the lives of these communities. Several people still struggle with that. People are still being jailed if they're found using drugs. We all know that. And things that we take for granted, are a big struggle for our key population. Simple things like opening bank accounts, using public transport, accessing public facilities like toilets, right? And not knowing, like in the lockdown, I heard several people of the community who used to, trans people who used to go shop to shop, blessing people and asking for money, were people who struggled to even, make their ends meet and could not find food. Because there was just no way that income was coming into their homes and in their families and into their hands. So food security also is an issue. Moving on, there are problems that key populations face on a daily living basis. Again, things that we feel ho jayega, people will find jobs, but it is not the case. Imagine the situation of a young trans person who is forced to move out of his family or her family simply because of the ridicule, the pressure, and not being included in any family functions, and finally being asked to leave. The person migrates to a city, they do not have a safe place to sleep. They do not know where to go, where to live, who will give them their next meal, right? There is a tremendous amount of social isolation because nobody wants to socialize with you, right? And as a consequence, most of our people, you will hear this even in your client stories, within your own setups, they are vulnerable, to being a target of crime. So there are goons and hooligans and gundas that often target our key populations. Why are you sitting here and using drugs here? Give me money. Hafta that the police will ask, right? And abuse. So these are issues that plague key populations on a day-to-day basis, and they all add up and act upon their mental well-being. So I just want us to develop an understanding of when we see key populations in front of us, there is a backstory of where they are now and what all must have happened with them to get them to this stage. As you can see, risky behavior and them getting infected with HIV in the first place is quite self-explanatory if you have a life that looks like this. So naturally, we all will think that key populations have a high level of stigma, and that's absolutely true. But the perspective that I want to introduce here, that stigma is not like a single line. Stigma is complicated. So stigma can happen because of various things. So imagine if I am the latest case, okay, and I don't know whether it's true or false, but Shah Rukh Khan's son being booked by the NCB, right? So if it was not his son also, but any rich kid who was using drugs, the person may not be stigmatized to that extent unless he or she is found out. But an average drug user that you work with is heavily stigmatized, they are rejected. But it's not just the drug use, for example, or it's just not the sex work as a profession alone that is a cause for stigma. The degree of stigma that any person in the key populations face depends on several factors, and it gets complicated. For example, I may be a woman who's into sex work, right? Who comes from a very poor family in the first place, and therefore have no backing, no option, and also belong to the poor caste. So my family is also poor. They also don't have land, right? Vis-a-vis another person who comes from a good family or from a better class is likely to face less rejection, at least in a few circles. So if you apply these circles on every key population, you will realize that it's not only somebody's sexual identity which makes them stigmatized or the sex work profession that makes them stigmatized. It's multiple layers of doing things. If you look at it closely, even say, for example, people who use drugs, women who use drugs are way more stigmatized than men do. simply their ability to seek services is compromised there, because the amount of services available for women are so less, and that is based on the assumptions that women are so good, they don't do drugs, right? So it operates at multiple levels. It shows you various assumptions that people make about things. So we need to bear this in mind when assessing where is the stigma coming from, because when you start addressing stigma, if you're able to even acknowledge all these levels, it goes a long way to validate how your client sitting in front of you feels. They feel understood by the counselor. So it's the same thing again in a different diagram, but just to show various levels, that key populations often feel stresses, rejection, stigma from various levels, beginning with family, community, and policy level. One more kind of stigma that I guess you all have heard of by now, but I thought should just clarify it, is what we call as self-stigma, right? You must have heard this word several times. Self-stigma as a term came into being in the world of psychiatry, the world of psychological disorders. However, soon it was adopted to understand how people with stigmatized identities also feel. So self-stigmatization is a process in which a person with a mental health diagnosis, or for example, a person with a realization that I am a trans person, right, becomes aware of public stigma. So becomes aware that the world does not like trans people, agrees with those stereotypes, saying that trans people are bad, for example, that, if you are born a male, you have to be a man. If you are not that, then there's something wrong with you, and internalizes them by applying them to the self. To give you an example, like take an example of a person who's attracted to same-sex people. They may start believing that there is something wrong in the way they feel ashamed about themselves, that it is wrong, it is dirty to get attracted to other men when you are a man themselves. And therefore, what people say about MSM is right, that MSM are ill, they are mentally ill, and therefore I'm mentally ill, and therefore I hate myself. So that kind of an internal stigma is very, very harmful, because there are many devastating impact of this kind of a self-stigma on the person's own sense of self. The feeling of, level of shame is very, very deep. Low self-esteem, they feel inadequate, low confidence. These are just to name a few. As a counselor, one can first of all help a person to articulate internal stigma. Very often, where we counselors fall in the trap is that we assume, first of all, that the person has self-stigma, or we assume they don't have self-stigma. It's best to check. It's best to check by saying, how do you feel about yourself? What do you identify yourself as? Are you happy with yourself the way you are? Right? And if the person says, no, I don't think, I think I should go to some doctor, get electric shocks and change my sexual orientation, that's the time you need to invest a little more time and start gently asking the person about what the world says and what you feel, right? And try to bring out those discrepancies in saying that, what the world says and what you feel may not be true all the time. What you feel in your heart is the right thing. And simply because what the world says is something else, that doesn't make you wrong. And, show support of that kind. I'm not sure whether your setting allows you that kind of an interaction, but I just thought that this concept, spending some time on this concept is important. Now, I think this slide, if I was allowed an interactive sessions, you may add 20 more bullet points to this slide. But I feel that the high level challenges that we face, particularly with HIV and ART compliance, is to do with, loss to follow up. You are unable to trace people, and there is no proper traceable address. You don't know where to contact them. Mobile numbers keep changing, so you don't know which number you're calling all the time, right? There is non-disclosure, so no one knows anything about their status. In your counseling, sometimes you find that they're still engaging in unsafe behavior, and you feel very tempted to find all their partners and inform them. And you're also scared that their health is deteriorating. And because of non-disclosure, there is very poor partner testing, right? It gets a bit more complicated because, say, for example, with a married NSM, what partner testing are you talking about? Are you talking only about notifying the wife, or are you talking about telling their male partners too? So you'll have to think and talk to your client about who all do they need to disclose their HIV status to, right? So just keep this as pointers. So none of the questions that we raised earlier have any easy answers, but what I feel are easy things to remember. See, counseling key populations does not require, by and large, any specific skills of counseling. It is your same basic counseling principles and skills that matter. What really matters is reminding yourself who you're talking to, how you need to conduct yourself, and how do you make sure that you've developed the right sensitivities. For example, a few things to remember. When you are dealing with issues of disclosure and partner notification, you need to be understanding that disclosure is multifaceted, right? Just as I said, there are multiple stigma. So I could be a gay man who's also using drugs, correct? And I could be effeminate coming from a poor family, right? Or I could be a trans person who's using drugs and is into sex work. So what do you really disclose? Which of these identities do you really disclose, right? What do I disclose? Drug use, sexual orientation, gender identity, HIV status is not our decision, is the decision of our client. But it's better to have it as a discussion to understand. And it's okay if the client says, I have all these issues, but please don't tell my wife anything about my same-sex behavior. Just tell her about my HIV status. I think as counselors, we've always been taught to accept the client's decision, and the client always has the right to decide, and he or she knows the best what the decision is. So what should our role be? Our role is, without any debate, is to be supportive. We need to explain the need of disclosure. We need to explain that disclosure does not always lead to rejection. Disclosure can also lead to enhanced support, right? And can lead to better safety of their loved ones. Offer help in disclosure by discussing their anxieties about disclosure, by going over exactly how will they disclose. I have myself found that doing a role play of the conversation of disclosure goes a long way in building their confidence in breaking the news to their partners and getting them for testing. Provide IEC material to share with the family or the partners, which kind of factually explains things about HIV, for example, so that the credibility of information is not questioned. The family or the partner can read the information on their own also. And close the client session about disclosure preparation by offering to talk to the family or partner if needed before the partner testing. Because very often people will tell you, I'm too scared. But if you say that you do the initial talking and get the person to me, I'll talk. It goes a long way, not just in partner notification, but also gaining compliance from the partner. Disclosure, as I said, not only leads to notification, but also leads to a more supportive environment. Moving on. Okay. So now that we have heard about where the origins of stress, how rejection and negative life events in childhood, how lack of compliance with social norms lead to various problems in daily living, leads to various problems in key populations in their ability to seek their own rights like employment, education, health. And they face stigma at various levels because of who they are. So what are some of the identifiable mental health stressors or manifestations, you can call them? Is social isolation, feeling hopeless, having suicidal thoughts, being helpless, having poor physical health, poor self-care, feeling scared and nervous, You may also come across mood disturbances like being irritable, inability to sleep, so either sleeping too little or sleeping a lot, disturbances of appetite, either eating too much or too little, so therefore sudden weight loss or weight gain, uncontrolled anger outbursts, sometimes with even without a bit of a provocation, inability to concentrate, crying spells, poor eye contact, complaining of non-specific body pain without any underlying medical cause. So the person may come back to you repeatedly and say, today my back is hurting, today my head is hurting, my body aches. You have referred the person to a doctor and the doctor says there's nothing physically wrong with this person. Yet the person keeps complaining about aches and pains, but that's just somatic symptoms. The person, it's a cry for help. Refusal to take medicines or treatment, refusal to use safety as an expression of anger. I'm sure in all your careers, you must have come across at least one case where the person has told you, whoever has given me HIV, now I will spread it to the world. Mujhe apna badla lena hai, right? And increased use of alcohol and drugs as means of, coping. So while I have refrained from putting them under psychiatric diagnosis, I have called them simply as manifestations, because I don't want the focus of a session to be diagnostic in nature. I do not want us to categorize people into somebody is being anxious, somebody is being depressed, somebody is being bipolar or anything like that, because that is not the focus of this session. But by showing you a list of symptoms is a way of enabling all of us to observe through our interactions with our clients if they are showing any of these symptoms, so that we can appropriately take action. I think of all the lists that I showed you, the one aspect that needs a little deeper attention is suicidal ideation. A lot of people think that asking about suicide will make the person suicidal or will make the person to actually commit suicide, whereas it's the contrary. Just asking does not trigger a person to lead suicide. In fact, a lot of people who did not commit suicide but attempted said that because they found somebody to talk to them, right, that paused their thought process, they actually did not go ahead and commit suicide. So I think just checking, even routinely, how are you feeling? How are you feeling about your life? Do you feel happy? Are you looking forward to something, right? How do you feel about your life in general? Do you have thoughts at any time of doing something with your life, something bad? You can ask in an indirect way. I think what's important is we need to listen carefully. Remember, listening, active listening is a counseling skill that we need to practice. Now, here it is how it gets applied. Listen carefully with empathy, without judgment. If a person reports a suicidal idea, there's no need to panic, but your antenna needs to go up. You need to listen then carefully, because you have to assess them for suicide. You'll have to ask them if they've had similar thoughts earlier. If they've had similar thoughts earlier, did they make any attempts in the past, and what kind of attempts they were? What was the modality they used? Did they get any help for that, right? What stopped them back there? You need to ask also, why is the person wanting to die? Because usually a thought of suicide is a cry of help. So if there's something you can do about it, right? If the person feels like dying because they have absolutely no place to live, maybe you can refer them to a shelter, right? Maybe you can put them in touch with homes that can actually give them some help, and the person may actually feel helped at the end of it. You need to understand what is the strength of the thought. That is, how much is the person thinking about it? Since when is the person thinking about it? Is the person collecting information about ways to die, right? And what are their thoughts about the same? So for example, a person might say, sometimes I feel that nothing, this is not good enough. Now, what is the whole point in dying? So don't leave the person there, or don't super panic at that time. Ask the person, how often do you feel like that? Or so very likely the person might tell you, only when somebody doesn't talk to me well, I feel like that. Or if somebody abuses me verbally, I feel like that. And then you ask the person, after that incident is over, do you still feel like continuing that thought? And they say, no, then I feel okay. So that is how you need to assess the strength of the thought. If the strength of the thought is strong, then the person will have an elaborate plan. So you need to assess if the person has a plan. And you will be surprised, but people do tell you. Offer support, and this offer is actually an offer that you absolutely have to make. It's an offer support in form of referral. If you feel the person is very high on intent to commit suicide, has a plan, right? Has strong suicidal thoughts, is not taking any help that you're offering to help the person give up, deal with the reason of suicide, immediately refer the person to a mental health professional. They may admit the person in most cases and keep the person under observation and treat them for if there's depression underlying or if there is any other mental health issue. Ensure that the person is with somebody. If you can immediately ask the person who they live with or who is the closest person and call them and explain to the person that this person needs to be kept under watch. Instruct the person to remove all harmful objects from within their reach under lock and key, right? And provide a phone number. I'm not saying that everybody has to give their phone number, but if you have a suicide helpline, like NIMHANS has a helpline, they can call that. Tata Institute of Social Sciences as a helpline. It's a center called iCare that you can give numbers for. It's okay if you have very good rapport and if you give your number too, that they can call you if they feel the thoughts are getting stronger. If you've built enough rapport before that, very likely the person will call you. Encourage the person to talk, pause, call helpline before actually doing anything and be available. You need to make a psychiatric referral. If you realize that the intent is severe, there have been repeated acts of deliberate self-harm in your clients. If you look closely, you will see that some people will have, cut marks on their wrists, right? So those are called, it's not a suicide attempt really, but it's a kind of act of deliberate self-harm to ease the psychological pain that person has, to gain attention so that somebody will listen to them, empathize with them. If you see many of these acts of deliberate self-harm, refer them to a mental health professional. If you see hallucinations that a person is reporting voices, right, delusions, if the person is thinking that somebody is out there to harm them, and no matter how much rationally you try to tell them, they are just not getting convinced. If you see psychotic symptoms, which is quite obvious, if that is severe depression that doesn't respond to counseling, the person is very, very disheveled, doesn't eat anything, that is severe depression and is going for a long time, you need a referral. And of course, frequent relapsing substance abuse needs a different kind of a treatment, which is beyond HIV treatment. What are some of the strategies that we at our level can use to deal with mental health issues? So as I said earlier, severe forms of mental health issues need psychiatric referral because they might need more clinical diagnosis and clinical treatment for some of the illnesses, right? But there are milder forms of mental health issues that can be dealt at our level. Again, as I said right at the beginning of this presentation, that you do not need any extra form of counseling training for that. But what you need to do is make sure that we use our counseling skills with the correct perspective to the right use. So for example, acceptance and empathize with key populations, particularly because we're talking about, I think the issue is really of acceptance. Accepting people for who they are without judging them is the basic key to begin any therapeutic relationship. Rapport cannot be established without acceptance. Because even if you feel that you have accepted, you will get to know from your client's reaction that rapport is not built really. Being non-judgmental is extremely easily said, but very difficult to do. For example, I'll share my own experience. Like the first time I met a Hijra client in front of me, that person was not clearly dressed as a woman, neither the person was clearly dressed as a man. So they had a shirt pant with hair tied in a choti with a gajra in it and bangles in one hand and a watch in another hand. So I struggled what to call the person. Then I reminded myself that maybe my face is giving. So I smiled and I apologized. And I said, I'm so sorry, but I don't know what to call you. And I don't have your case paper with me. And the person said, you called me by X name, right? And that is how I kind of forced myself to be non-judgmental. So even if the person standing in front of you is dressed differently and appears differently, it's your job to show your open-mindedness and ask the person. That shows that you are ready to learn about them, that you are ready to listen to them, that you are interested in them, right? It is okay to ask the person, how do they identify themselves and by what name should you call them? Be interested in their life and appreciate the struggle for their survival. So rather than just dismissing, oh yeah, this trans person is on that truck stop every evening, so fine. I think it might help a little more to understand how long hours they work, how long do they keep standing, what kind of food do they actually eat, right? And do they have a safe place to sleep, and what kind of experiences do they have? Client confidentiality cannot be stressed more. I know it's one of the basic tenets of counseling, but I think it's even more heightened when you work with key populations, simply because key populations have already faced so much of stigma. A counselor is the last person they expect, further stigma from. And one of the reasons where people feel most stigmatized is when their identity or anything about their personal history gets leaked out, right? So there are many ways in which confidentiality can be broken, and I'll talk about this later on. I think by and large, win trust, talk to other stakeholders in your client's life. So as I said, for disclosure, offer to talk to partners, parents, families, to decrease stress and increase acceptance in family, right? Do not impose that you want to talk with family, but if you show willingness, your client will come to a point where they will say that maybe my mom doesn't understand me when I tell her, but maybe she will understand you. As Shweta ma'am, when she introduced me, she said, I work with parents of LGBTQI, and that is exactly what I do for a very long time, is helping parents accept their kids and their sexual and gender identity. Offer counseling to partners to decrease violence. You will notice that there is a high level of intimate partner violence within key populations. Partners cheating on each other, partners getting married and not revealing it to their spouses. So that's an area that you definitely can address, and make extra efforts to link key populations to all other allied services for employment opportunities, for shelter, for food, for financial assistance. Because otherwise, despite understanding the various circles that affect their lives, we've not touched any of them. I think work with key population needs you to be an advocate yourself beyond counseling. So I think at minimum, what we should do is we need to advocate for making our own setting stigma-free, correct? So ensure that nobody in your setting is calling out names loudly. Nobody in your setting is discriminating by keeping certain populations longer. Like, for example, I did a research some years back, and the transgender people told me that, ma'am, in the line, I don't know why they keep pushing us back. The rest, everybody goes in the front. We are the last. In some hospitals, people with HIV, their surgeries are scheduled to be at the end of the day. Why? Because sanitization takes longer. Whereas I'm sure that sanitization has to be done after every surgery, right? So I don't understand why some form of discriminatory behaviors like this exist. Don't yell. I've noticed in several places that people just yell more at some kinds of people and less at some kinds of people. So this kind of changes in the environment go a long way, even in making your own ART center or your own CBO, your own counseling room, a safe space. I have been a counselor in my past life, so I know how ART centers look like. I know the amount of bheed, the amount of or the lack of space that it has. Sometimes group counseling works. So I'm sure a lot of you have already experimented with this format, but forming groups with similar profiles to share experiences, share their stories, so that they start building informal support system to one another is a useful thing. So for example, one of the groups that we ran here in Bombay with all transgender clients actually got people jobs, not through any other CBOs or NGOs, but through their own referral networks. Like there are people who went to other people's houses to convince their parents about being good to their own children. So you don't know how much social support can be fostered in these groups also, but it does require some amount of dedication and skill, because this is not just information giving, but this is helping people connect with each other. I think I've already mentioned the need to develop a strong referral network, and use of IEC material wherever you can to convey feeling of safe space, to convey destigmatization of the facility. Now we come to the part where we talk about counselors themselves, right? So self-reflection while working with key population is very important. Most of us, where we come from, the way we've been raised with very typical notions of gender norms, very typical gender roles that got portrayed perhaps for most of us, and I'm making generalizations here, in the way a mom behaved like a typical mom, our dad behaved like a typical dad, a brother behaved like a typical bhaiya, and a didi behaved like a typical didi. And in school, we had friends where up until certain class, we all played together. But then once we reached puberty, the girls stopped playing and the boys kept playing. So I think when we start working with key populations, many a times in a very unconscious manner, these gender assumptions that we've grown up with, right, come into play. So if you see a woman who loves another woman, you will say, you will very often catch yourself asking, is it possible? How do they do it? Right? But I think we need to watch ourselves. We cannot unlearn what we have done in the past completely, but we can be watchful more and start learning new and differently. Right? So for example, these are just some questions for me to provoke you. But like I said, in my first counseling experience, when I saw a person standing in front of me, wearing a shirt, pant, long hair with gajra and bangles and a watch, but a formal shirt, pant, I was completely confused and I didn't know what to say, what to call this person in front of me. So because I had gender ideas about how a man should be and how a woman should be, right? So I think you need to start reflecting of what your expectations are around gender roles. What are your experiences are in terms of gender discrimination yourself? As a woman or as a man, have you been forced to choose a different profession? How did it make you feel? I think doing these exercises with yourself helps you naturally to increase your empathy while working with key populations. Well, I must say that working with key populations can be quite stressful, right? And counselors need to take care of themselves. And I'm not saying it is stressful because you are doing something tremendously so difficult. I think it's stressful because when you start working with key populations and when you realize the feeling of empathy, you realize that you are checking a lot of your assumptions in life. So for example, when you really go deep and you start truly experiencing empathy with key populations, you start reflecting on your own gender experiences in life. You start reflecting yourself that, oh, I actually like to have short hair, but I'm tying a big long choti with gajra now. Will I have the guts someday to cut my hair in a boy cut? Because I love women having short hair. So it's stressful at various levels. There are sometimes stories you hear. Remember the iceberg that I showed you? If the entire iceberg gets revealed to you for even one of the key population's life, it can have a lot of impact on you in terms of what you hear, because it is heart-wrenching to know cases where mothers give different food portions to two children in the same family, simply because one boy is more effeminate and the other boy is not. So when you hear instances like this, it is bound to affect you. But when you are dealing with difficult cases, particularly difficult cases that you don't know what to do with, either A, because you are not able to draw a boundary, or B, because you really don't know what to do. You've tried everything. It's best to discuss cases with seniors, supervisors, or experts. You need to learn to draw boundaries, which means you do not carry work home. Sorry, there's a typo there. And do not discuss cases at home. It's very tempting, when you work with key populations, because it's like a a whole new world is open in front of your eyes. So for example, when I started working with MSM, there was a particular bus that I used to take to work, right? And I took that bus to work for 7 years. But after first month of my job, the outreach worker in the NGO that I used to work with said, which bus do you take? I said, I told him I take this bus. He said, oh, that is my outreach spot. I said, it's your outreach spot? He said, yeah, I will show you. He said, don't stand close to me, stand far away from me and just watch me. You want to see MSM? I said, no, I don't want to see MSM. No, I will show you how things work. And then I realized that the same bus stop where I took a bus every day to work was actually a cruising spot. I was so excited to learn that because it was a new world opening in front of my eyes, which I was completely blind to all my life. But I had to curtail my excitement and not rush home and tell people. Even when I revealed this example to you, I have not told you the bus number of which bus stop. So do not discuss cases at home. You can discuss stress at home, saying that I'm feeling very tired. I heard stories which made me feel very sad and upset, but do not get into details of it. At the same time, if you have fights at home, do not carry that with you at work. I know it's easily said and done, but if you are in the profession of counseling and if you want to maintain your sanity, you will have to learn to make these into compartments, right? Also, you might automatically think, I cannot, share with my spouse, for example. I cannot share, I cannot, carry my anger with my mother-in-law to work. I can at least talk to my colleague. You can talk about your mother-in-law to your colleague. That is not an issue. But you cannot even discuss with your colleague about what happened with client X in details. You can at the most ask that I want a shelter home referral. Do you have one? Right? If you need to talk to discuss the case, then you go to a supervisor, you go to somebody senior. The reason being that it breaches confidentiality. Remember, I said in one of the previous slides, confidentiality can be breached in many ways. So it is not only not talking at home, but also not talking to your co-workers, unless you are referring the case or unless you are handing over the case. So once again, confidentiality is important, except when you're referring or if you're handing over the case. Rapport building is needed, but there is a line to be drawn there also. Between becoming open to learning and being too intrusive. We need to learn that we are still professionals and we need to still be in our professional shoes. So for example, asking a transgender woman about how do her genitals really look like, because you become friendly with the trans person and they tell you everything in their life, doesn't mean that you can ask them their most private information, right? Or asking a woman, oh, you're attracted to other women and you've been good in your counseling relationship, but that still doesn't mean that you ask the other woman, that you ask your client, how do two women do it? That is not professional, and that is really highly discouraged and unethical, if you ask me. Do not discuss your clients with your colleagues. Do not reveal anybody's HIV status. I need not tell this group because I think this group has learned it since the day one on their job. But at the same time, it's not only about HIV status. You can disclose many things, right? So you can say, hey, that person who went, no, now, that person, the way she looks, no, she is actually a sex worker. She talks so nicely, no, but she's a sex worker, right? So it shows your judgment and it shows your unprofessionalism. So just be mindful of that. So these are some of my thoughts that I thought I'll share with you today. We'll have some time, I guess, to answer question and answers. But I thought that today's presentation was my way of building your perspective on what kind of mental health challenges key populations face. And as counselors, as service providers, what should our stance be? How should we approach these situations? Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Participants are requested to kindly unmute their mics, or even they can write their questions in the chat box if they have any questions.
Can I stop sharing the screen?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am.
Please feel free to unmute your mics. I don't think there are any questions, ma'am. Participants are requested to kindly write back to us in case they have any queries, and we can forward them to ma'am.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you so much,
Thank you,
iTech,
ma'am.
for having me over today. Thank you, everybody, for patiently listening.
Thank you, ma'am. We can close the session now.
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you.